Hello, this is Mark Tooley, editor of Providence, a journal of Christianity and American foreign policy here in Washington, D.C., with the pleasure today of speaking with my friend, Father Drew Christiansen at Georgetown University, formerly editor of America magazine, a Jesuit priest and distinguished scholar who has edited a new book on a world free from nuclear weapons, which shares the latest Catholic thinking on nuclear weapons and, if I understand it correctly, advocates for the abolition of nuclear weapons globally. So Father Drew, it's great to have you in this conversation.
Good to be with you, Mark.
So what is this book actually about? What does it contain? What is its purpose?
Well, its purpose is to acquaint people with the kind of discussion that went around the negotiation and the adoption of the treaty to prohibit nuclear weapons that was completed in the summer of 2017. Pope Francis, with Cardinal Turkson, hosted a meeting at the Vatican the following November. And the book contains the papers presented there, and they're by a variety of people, by several Nobel Prize laureates who made individual presentations, but also wrote to the Pope a collective letter. And then diplomats who were involved in the negotiation in one way or another, or not, like Rose Gottmuller from the US. She was by that time she was Deputy Secretary General of NATO, but she'd been Undersecretary of State in the US for International Security and Disarmament Affairs. And she did a quote unquote debate. Basically, they were set speeches with two of the people who were principal movers of the treaty. Ambassador Jorge Lamonico from Mexico, who is said to have been the intellectual author of the document. And then an ambassador from Hiroshi, I think, from Austria. Is an old Hungarian name, so I'm not sure how to pronounce it, Magyar, but they also spoke. And then a lot of people from civil society, including Beatrice Finn, who represented ICAN, the International Campaign Against Nuclear Weapons, which was one of the civil society sponsors of the activity that led up to the ban treaty, and they had won the Nobel Peace Prize that year. So, and then we had delegations of students from our three Jesuit universities, or the three Catholic universities that were collaborating together: Georgetown, Catholic University of America, and Notre Dame, and a couple of faculty members as well. So it was quite a range of people, and the idea was to kind of begin to get the sense of how this treaty had arisen and how people from different parts of the world, including Africa, looked on this kind of project.
And does this work represent a transition in Catholic thought in terms of absolutizing a prohibition on nuclear weapons that perhaps was not present in the teachings of previous popes like John Paul II?
Well, I would say it's a step. It's not a big step, because as early as Pacem in Terris in 1963, Saint Pope John XXIII had said that, in speaking of nuclear disarmament, that the end was the abolition of nuclear weapons. So he already projected that, and the Vatican and the U.S. Bishops' Conference, actually, in the 90s, both said that the ultimate goal of policy ought to be the abolition of nuclear weapons. So it wasn't that this is the time to come, but that the time had come at that point, but that they foresaw that as being where we were moving. And then I'd say early in the last decade, the representatives of the Holy See, the secretaries of state for relations with state, or the Secretary of State himself, at various UN meetings, had spoken about uh, uh, against deterrence as being a kind of obstacle to abolition and ultimately kind of advocating for abolition. So when this conference took place, the Vatican had already signed and ratified the treaty. It had been close to some of the people who had organized the negotiation. And Pope Francis, at a meeting, at an audience with the participants in the conference, or the symposium as it was called, basically offered the first kind of condemnation of deterrence. It wasn't just a questioning of it. It wasn't kind of saying that it was an obstacle. He said that the possession of nuclear weapons and the use or threat to use of nuclear weapons was to be firmly condemned. And so that what was new. It was a firm condemnation. It wasn't just in prospect. It arrived. And since then, he's reiterated that last year in Nagasaki and Hiroshima, and then again, it's been reiterated it again this year a couple of times. So it's a firm position that he's taken, and it's now been absorbed, I think, into the teaching of the church.
Now, if I'm recalling correctly, back in the 1980s, the American Catholic bishops' pastoral letter on nuclear weapons took a strong stance against nuclear weapons, but again, if I'm recalling correctly, it suggested that in terms of America's nuclear umbrella for Western Europe under NATO, that with the removal of nuclear weapons, there should be the replacement of conventional arms to counteract the Soviet Union. But many have the impression that Pope Francis is, and of course, back in those days, the objections to nuclear weapons were often from a just war argument. But many have the impression today that Pope Francis has moved away, if not rejected outright, the just war tradition in terms of at least a few words that are said about it in the latest papal encyclical, Fratelli Tutti, if I'm pronouncing that correctly.
Fratelli,
so
yeah.
Is that impression correct? Is Pope Francis essentially moving towards a pacifist stance for the church?
Well, I think he's resisting going to a pacifist stance. He's been urged by Pax Christi International, and at least a wing of Pax Christi International. Pax Christi would like him to take a just peace position, which is a position which was articulated by Protestant and Catholic moralists back in the 90s, including the late John Langan from the Georgetown faculty, to kind of expand the grounds that would, the various things that you could do to avoid war, I suppose, to raise the level of the ability to have recourse to war, and but within that, there's also been a group that's urged him to reject just war. He's not done that, but I'd say that Tutti Fratelli certainly asked some hard questions, and I've had a couple of pieces I've done for America and for the Berkeley Forum at Georgetown, which have talked about what he does. And he talks about humanitarian, defensive, and precautionary excuses. And well, those are all types of rationales for resorting to force. Humanitarian arguments. Precautionary is the international legal language for just war principles. They're basically the same principles, but the international lawyers since the 1890s have called them precautionary. And basically that's jus ad bellum principles. And, to call them all excuses is really kind of putting the legitimacy of just war in question. But he doesn't go so far as to condemn it outright, as far as I see. But he's putting more distance, he's more skeptical. And I think for the same reasons that John Paul II grew skeptical in the end. If you remember Centesimus Annus, his John Paul's encyclical on the anniversary of Rerum Novarum, he has 3 paragraphs. I think it's 22, 25, and 52 that talk about war. And in 22 and 25, or 23 and 25, and then again in 52, he lays out kind of reasoning. And the first two are more spiritual reasons. And that's where he kind of identifies with the suffering Christ as a model of nonviolent transformation of history. And then and says that the people who won the victory over communism in 1989 won it by persistence in the nonviolent actions. But then in 52, he quotes Paul VI about war never again. And then he elaborates what happens as war. And it's a long Ciceronian sentence, but he talks about all the consequences of war. And so what you see is that he's using kind of just war arguments against, well, I won't say against, but that put into question the possibility of a just war. And so he was moving that direction, I think, in his last years as well. And I think what we see with Pope Francis is his arguments still tend to be just war arguments. One place I quote James Turner Johnson, a Protestant moralist who was very critical of bishops, U.S. bishops. And he said when it came to nuclear war, they were just war pacifists. Mm. So they opposed the use of nuclear weapons in warfare on just war grounds. Well, I think what you can say is that Francis seems to be questioning the use of just war rationale on just war grounds as well, mm-hmm. On the consequences, and much too as John Paul II did, because of what it does to the people who do it, or what it does in terms of wider consequences. And the wider consequences he traces out in different parts of Tutti Frutti. Sorry, I apologize.
We all say that.
Tutti Frutti. In terms of his thesis about connections. And so what he sees is that there are ways on ways of consequences that proceed from going to war. So the simplest one that we can look at more recently is the refugee question. That if war produces, even civil conflict, produces refugees, and that problem isn't solved, then you continue to have more problems in terms of the internal cohesion of social groups like the European Union, and internal tensions within political blocs and so on and so forth. And so he says, you have to consider that these ripples, if you will, of violence that proceed. And it's when you take that view of proportionality ad bellum, it becomes much more difficult to say, well, we really need to use force. And in the two articles I've done, and I hope to have an expanded version out later, I look at the responsibility to protect, which it seems to me is, in a sense, even at one point, George Weigel said, now this is really what fits with what Augustine meant by just war, that you're protecting innocent people who are being slaughtered by others. So you're intervening to protect them. In those situations, you have to use restraint, and I think that I think that Francis is insisting that even there we look very carefully, but it seems to me we can't abandon that. I think Pope Benedict, in his address to the UN in 2008, gave a very strong endorsement of the responsibility to protect. And the responsibility to protect also coincides with the definition of political legitimacy in Pacem in Terris, which is the kind of cornerstone of modern Catholic political thought, based on human rights. And it says that the end of the universal common good, for which there needs to be some kind of public authority, should defend and protect the human rights of all people. And that, when their own states don't do it, then other political authorities, is the term that Parchmentarius uses, need to take action. Well, that's essentially the argument you have in the jurisprudence of R2P, responsibility to protect, that when a state ceases to protect people, and sovereignty is understood in terms of the right to protect the population and empower their rights. If you cease to do that, then other powers have a duty to intervene to protect those people. And I don't see him walking away from that, or the church as a whole walking away from that. I think that's too central to our understanding what political legitimacy is.
So there could never be a complete rejection of lethal force by legitimate authorities, because civil order depends on it ultimately.
I think so. I don't think that can be complete, and I think he's been very careful about not doing that. But rhetorically, he takes a fairly strong position.
And for critics of this perspective on nuclear weapons, or on his wider stance on war and peace issues, they would say nuclear weapons are a reality, that inevitably some regimes are going to retain them, that they're impervious to any moral appeals. So the only regimes that would be influenced by these moral appeals are those regimes that in fact need the weapons most to defend civil order from aggressors. So what would be the response to those kinds of practical arguments?
Well, I don't think that Francis or the Holy See are opposed to negotiation and step-by-step disarmament. And the hard questions get when you get down below 500 weapons on the side, I think. But short of that, the Holy See has continued to insist on the need for negotiation. But also it's insisted on something which is embedded in the Non-Proliferation Treaty, Article 6, which is general and complete disarmament, which relates to your other issue about conventional defenses. It's a much harder issue, but I think it's going to get new attention because of the problems of deterrence today. Deterrence is in very bad shape, geostrategically and conceptually. You have now 9 nuclear powers, both superpowers and regional powers, who are having a deterrence in that kind of context. It's not the same as having when you have 2 superpowers. It's a much more difficult calculation and much more easy to be deceived and so on. And then you have the complications that are added by some very close regional rivalries like India and Pakistan, or Iran and Israel, and so it seems to me that triggers for regional nuclear war are there that could lead to a larger conflagration. In addition, you have the new technologies which increase the possibility of accidents and miscalculations. Cyber warfare, for instance, which is a major threat, and we haven't begun to really grapple with what that means for nuclear weapons, or the new weapons like the hypersonic weapons, which you can't defend against. So any kind of ABM system will not be able to defend it, or certain kind of submarine ballistic missiles they have now or torpedoes that really are very stealthy and can't be detected. So the situation has gotten much, much more difficult. And it seems to me that for that reason, I think in time, abolition is going to be more appealing to everyone. Negotiating down to the end, getting monitoring, verification, compliance, all that's going to be difficult. But it seems to me that the current kind of confusion of the whole field of deterrence means that it's going to collapse of its own weight.
And finally, Father Drew, a getting more theological and maybe challenging for you, but you'll enjoy the challenge. A realist, a Christian realist, and others would say, won't war and aggression, given the state of fallen humanity, war and aggression will always be with us till the end of the age. It can be limited, contained, forestalled, but never eliminated, and therefore appropriate precautions must always be taken. So what would your response be to that?
Yeah, I think if you look at John Paul, you see someone who, in a particular very heightened situation, thought that deterrence would work, and therefore established the kind of framework out of which the U.S. bishops worked in greater detail for the three conditions for nuclear for nuclear deterrent to be moral. By the time he gets to 1991, he's also advocated nonviolence. In Poland, his leadership there was a nonviolent leadership. He counseled people in nonviolence. When he wrote Synthesis Massonis, he praises the nonviolent activists who brought about the change. And he says, it's a very complicated, it's difficult to remember phrase, but he talks about how those who opted for nonviolence knew the difference between, if you will, between the cowardice that gives in to oppression on the one hand, and the violence that's generated in the name of defending against oppression. So that he was saying, yeah, I begin to see that violence is committed by people who carry out war in just causes. And that's the walk that we all have to do, it seems to me. And I mean, Christians can never keep nonviolence out of their arsenal, it seems to me, and keep on a dialogue in their own heads going on between nonviolence, not necessarily pacifism, but nonviolence and just war. It seems to me that we each need to be constantly questioning whether the violence we're going to do is going to cause greater violence than we're trying to overcome, or whether it'll set in motion a chain reaction that will be difficult to stop. And for that reason, we need to have restraint. The bishops in 93 said, you can't practice just war without the spirit of restraint and moderation. And it seems to me that means, constantly being in dialogue with nonviolence as you carry out, your just war principles.
Father Drew Christiansen, editor of this new book on freeing the world from nuclear weapons. Thank you very much for a fascinating conversation.
Thank you, Mark. It's been very good being with you and with your audience.